Today we are pulling back the heavy velvet curtains on a life that truly had it all. This is the story of a woman whose fate was inextricably linked with two mighty yet profoundly different empires. She was a princess born in the misty highlands of Scotland, a product of the rigid, unyielding world of Victorian England, who would become the sun-drenched, embattled Queen of Spain. Her journey is a breathtaking saga of a fairy tale wedding that turned into a bloodbath, a passionate love that curdled into bitter resentment, and a mother's love tested by a cruel genetic curse that would haunt her dynasty. Get ready for the incredible, often overlooked and deeply moving story of Princess Victoria Eugenie of Battenberg, the woman who her family called Ina, and whom a nation would come to know as their last, and perhaps most tragic, queen. To truly understand the woman Victoria Eugenie would become, you must first immerse yourself in the world that created her. Imagine the final decades of the 19th century. This was not just a period. It was an entire worldview, an era dominated by the colossal figure of her grandmother, Queen Victoria. By the time of Ina's birth in 1887, Victoria was the Empress of India, the ruler of a quarter of the world's population, and the matriarch of a sprawling family whose blood ran through nearly every royal house in Europe. She was, quite literally, the grandmother of Europe, and her children and grandchildren were her most valuable diplomatic assets. A royal marriage was never just a union of two people. It was a strategic alliance, a treaty sealed with a vow, a delicate move on the great chessboard of continental power. Every eligible prince and princess was a pawn in this intricate game, their personal desires secondary to the stability of empires. Into this world of immense pressure and unyielding protocol, Victoria Eugenie was born not at the center of power, but in a slightly awkward peripheral position. She was born at Balmoral Castle, the Queen's beloved Scottish retreat, a place of rugged beauty and relative informality. Yet, her family, the Battenbergs, occupied a curious and often uncomfortable space within the royal hierarchy. Her father was the handsome and dashing Prince Henry of Battenberg. Her mother, Princess Beatrice, was the ninth and youngest child of Queen Victoria, her baby, the apple of her mother's eye. The story of their marriage is central to understanding Ina's upbringing. Queen Victoria's love for her children was fierce, but it was also profoundly possessive. After the devastating death of her husband, Prince Albert, she had clung to her children with a sorrowful tenacity. Princess Beatrice, her youngest, was her constant companion, her confidant, and her private secretary. The Queen had almost resigned herself to the idea that Beatrice would remain unmarried, forever by her side. When Beatrice fell in love with Prince Henry, Victoria was initially apoplectic. She refused to speak to her daughter for 7 months, communicating only through notes. She eventually relented, but on one non-negotiable condition. The couple must live with her. They were never to have a home of their own. Beatrice would continue her duties as the Queen's companion, and her husband and future children would become permanent residents of the Queen's household. This arrangement shaped Ina's childhood profoundly. Unlike her cousins, who might have had some semblance of a separate family life, Ina and her 3 brothers grew up in the direct, unceasing shadow of their formidable grandmother. Their homes were the Queen's homes, the grandeur of Windsor Castle, the seaside air of Osborne House on the Isle of Wight, and the misty moors of Balmoral. Life was a whirlwind of royal routine, dictated by the Queen's schedule, her moods, and her strict mourning for a husband who had died decades before Ina was even born. Furthermore, the Battenberg name itself carried a faint whiff of scandal and snobbery. The family's origins were from a morganatic marriage, a union between someone of royal blood and a person of lower rank. Ina's paternal grandfather, Prince Alexander of Hesse and by Rhine, had married a lady-in-waiting, Julia Hauke, who was not of royal birth. While she was later granted the title Princess of Battenberg, their children were styled Serene Highness, rather than the more prestigious Royal Highness. In the rigidly stratified world of European royalty, this was a significant distinction. It meant that while Ina was the granddaughter of the Queen of England, she was also, through her father, from a lineage that some of the older, prouder royal houses looked down upon. This subtle sense of being lesser than instilled in the young princess a certain shyness, a quiet reserve that would be misinterpreted later in her life. She was taught from birth that her position was both a great privilege and a precarious one, dependent entirely on the goodwill of her English grandmother. Ina's early life, therefore, was a study in contradictions. She was surrounded by opulence and the levers of global power, yet her immediate family had no real independence. She was doted upon by her grandmother, yet constantly reminded of her duty and the need for impeccable behavior. It was a gilded cage, comfortable and secure, but a cage nonetheless. Her father, Prince Henry, a vibrant and adventurous man, often felt stifled by the suffocating routine of the Victorian court. He yearned for action and purpose beyond being the Queen's son-in-law. In late 1895, against the Queen's wishes, he volunteered to fight in the Anglo-Ashanti War in Africa. Within weeks, he contracted malaria. He died on the journey home in January 1896. His body returned to England for a state funeral. Ina was only 8 years old. The loss was devastating, not just for the family, but for the Queen herself, who mourned him as a son. For Ina, it was a brutal early lesson in the fragility of life and the deep, abiding sorrow that seemed to be a constant companion to her mother and grandmother. Following her husband's death, Princess Beatrice retreated even further into her role as her mother's shadow, her life now defined by a double mourning, for her husband and for her father. This atmosphere of perpetual grief and staid duty was the air Ina breathed. Yet, by all accounts, she was a spirited and joyful child, known for her striking looks. As she blossomed into a teenager, her blonde hair and piercing blue eyes made her one of the great beauties of the European royal set. She was lively, intelligent, and possessed a natural grace. But beneath the surface there was a quiet, invisible inheritance she carried, a dark secret woven into the very fabric of her royal bloodline, a genetic time bomb passed down from the grandmother she adored. This was the dreaded royal disease, hemophilia. Today we understand the genetics of this X-linked recessive disorder, but in the late 19th century it was simply a terrifying and unpredictable family curse. It had entered the royal family through Queen Victoria, who was a spontaneous mutant. She was a carrier, and she passed the gene to 3 of her 9 children. Her son Leopold, Duke of Albany, died from the disease at age 30. Her daughters, Alice and Beatrice, Ina's mother, were carriers. This meant that Princess Beatrice had a 50% chance of passing the hemophilia gene to each of her sons, and a 50% chance of passing the carrier status to each of her daughters. The reality of this curse was already a painful part of Ina's family life. Her own brother Leopold was a hemophiliac. His childhood was a terrifying cycle of bruises, internal bleeding, and constant agonizing pain. The family lived in perpetual fear that any minor bump or fall could trigger a fatal hemorrhage. Another brother, Maurice, was killed in action at the First Battle of Ypres in 1914. While there has been some speculation, there is no historical evidence to suggest he was a hemophiliac. Living with this reality, seeing her brothers suffering firsthand, must have been profoundly frightening for Ina. Yet the true nature of its transmission was shrouded in mystery and misinformation. No one knew for certain which of the women in the family were carriers. A beautiful princess from a carrier line was, to knowledgeable royal suitors, damaged goods. She represented a potential dynastic catastrophe. For Ina, this was a sword of Damocles hanging over her future, a future that was rapidly approaching. In 1901, the seemingly eternal reign of Queen Victoria finally came to an end. Her death plunged the nation into mourning and marked the end of an era. For Ina, it was the loss of the central defining figure of her existence. The court changed, becoming the more flamboyant, modern, and worldly court of her uncle, King Edward VII. Suddenly, the quiet girl from Victoria's secluded household was a young, eligible woman, a princess whose marriage was now a matter of state. She was one of the most beautiful and well-connected princesses in Europe. Suitors were considered, alliances were weighed. There was talk of a match with her cousin, the German crown prince, which would have placed her on the throne of Europe's most powerful new empire. But destiny and the discerning eye of another young monarch had a very different path in mind for her. This new path would take her far from the gray skies and rigid protocols of England to a land of blazing sun, passionate traditions, and simmering political unrest. It was a path that promised the dazzling crown of a queen, but it would demand a price so steep, so steeped in blood and tears, that it would nearly destroy her. The last rose of Victoria's garden was about to be transplanted into a foreign and far more dangerous soil. We left Victoria Eugenie, or Ina, as she was intimately known, on the cusp of a new and formidable destiny. The death of her grandmother, Queen Victoria, had closed the chapter on her sheltered childhood, thrusting her into the brilliant, fast-paced world of the Edwardian era under her uncle, King Edward VII. She was now one of Europe's most eligible princesses, a stunning beauty, with the unimpeachable blood of the British monarchy flowing in her veins. Yet she was also the bearer of a silent, invisible risk, the Battenberg's slightly diminished status, and the far more dangerous shadow of the royal disease. Her future, and the future of any dynasty she married into, was a gamble. The question was, who would be willing to take it? The answer would come from a kingdom that could not have been more different from her own, the ancient, proud, and volatile realm of Spain. The man who would change her life forever was King Alfonso XIII. To understand the magnetic and ultimately destructive pull between them, you must first understand him. Alfonso was a king unlike any other in Europe. He had been born a monarch. His father, Alfonso XII, had died of tuberculosis months before his birth, leaving his wife Maria Christina of Austria to act as regent until their son came of age. From the moment he drew his first breath in May 1886, he was His Majesty, the King of Spain. This unique circumstance bred in him a supreme, almost reckless self-confidence. He had never known a life other than being the center of his nation's universe. He came of age and took full power in 1902, a dashing figure of boundless energy. He was charming, quick-witted, and possessed a restless, modern spirit. While Ina's childhood was defined by Victorian propriety and mourning, Alfonso's was filled with military uniforms, political intrigue, and a court that, while steeped in the most rigid Catholic traditions in Europe, was also a hotbed of gossip and passion. He was obsessed with the future. He adored fast cars, becoming a notorious speed demon on Spain's primitive roads. He was an early adopter of photography and film, and he was fascinated by all manner of technology. Yet, this modern man was also the ruler of a country struggling to escape its past. Spain was a nation of stark contrasts, immense aristocratic wealth and grinding peasant poverty, deep Catholic faith and a rising tide of violent anarchism, a glorious imperial history and a present reality of political instability and military humiliation, most recently in the Spanish-American War of 1898. Governing this tinderbox required a deft political touch, and many observers worried that the young king, for all his charm, was impulsive and politically immature. He was also, by the time he began his search for a queen, already a notorious womanizer. His affairs were an open secret in Madrid, a habit that spoke of a deep-seated need for adoration and a restless, undisciplined nature. He was searching for a queen who could provide him with heirs, enhance Spain's prestige, and, on a personal level, a woman who could truly captivate him. He had considered other princesses, but none had sparked his interest. That was, until his state visit to London in 1905. The meeting was masterfully orchestrated by Ina's uncle, King Edward VII. Known as the Uncle of Europe, Edward was a natural diplomat who saw the strategic value in tying Spain closer to Great Britain and away from the orbit of his other nephew, the German Kaiser. He knew the young Spanish king was on the hunt for a bride, and he had his beautiful unmarried niece, Ina, ready to be presented. The stage was set at a lavish dinner at Buckingham Palace. When King Alfonso XIII laid eyes on the 19-year-old Princess Victoria Eugenie, with her radiant complexion, shimmering blonde hair, and shy, graceful demeanor, he was utterly thunderstruck. She was the complete opposite of the dark-haired beauties of the Spanish aristocracy. He was, by all accounts, immediately and completely infatuated. He made his interest known at once, paying her conspicuous attention throughout his visit. Ina, who had been raised in a world of quiet restraint, was suddenly the focus of a dashing, powerful king's intense admiration. She was undoubtedly charmed. He was worldly, attentive, and treated her not as a political pawn, but as a desirable woman. A flurry of letters and discreet communications followed his departure. A romance, chaperoned by the highest levels of European diplomacy, had begun to blossom, but the path from Buckingham Palace to the Royal Palace of Madrid was strewn with formidable obstacles. The opposition to the match in Spain was immediate and fierce. The idea of a Protestant queen in the land of the Catholic monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, was anathema to the conservative court, the powerful clergy, and much of the aristocracy. Leading the charge against the union was the most powerful woman in Spain, Alfonso's own mother, the Queen Regent Maria Cristina. A stern, devout, and politically savvy Habsburg, Maria Cristina had expertly guided the country during her son's minority and did not approve of the English princess. She worried about Ina's Protestantism, her family's inferior Battenberg blood, and, crucially, the persistent ominous rumors of ill health that clung to Queen Victoria's descendants. She had other, more suitable Catholic princesses in mind for her son. But for the first time, Alfonso, headstrong and infatuated, was determined to defy her. The most significant public hurdle was, of course, religion. There was no possibility of Ina becoming Queen of Spain without converting to Roman Catholicism. For a direct granddaughter of Queen Victoria, the titular head of the Church of England, this was a monumental step, one that carried immense personal and political weight. It meant renouncing the faith of her family, her upbringing, and her nation. This decision caused a great deal of consternation back in Britain. While her uncle King Edward was pragmatic about it, there was a public outcry. Anti-Catholic sentiment still ran deep, and the move was seen by some as a betrayal. For Ina herself, it must have been a period of profound soul-searching. She was given religious instruction by the Bishop of Nottingham and underwent a period of study. Whether her conversion was a matter of true spiritual conviction or a pragmatic necessity to secure her crown is a question only she could answer. But she took the step, publicly embracing her new faith at a ceremony at the Miramar Palace in San Sebastian, Spain. She had crossed her Rubicon. With the religious issue settled, the whispers about her health grew louder. Was King Alfonso truly aware of the risk of hemophilia? The historical record is murky. It is almost certain that the danger was communicated to the Spanish court. Ina's own mother, Princess Beatrice, was deeply anxious about it. Some accounts suggest that the Spanish doctors and courtiers, perhaps eager to please their love-struck king, deliberately downplayed the genetic science, which was still in its infancy. Others claim that Alfonso, in a fit of romantic bravado, simply dismissed the concerns. One famous, perhaps apocryphal quote attributed to him is that the Bourbons had enough healthy blood to overcome any risks. It was a fateful, arrogant gamble. He was staking the future health of his dynasty on the beauty of a woman he barely knew. Despite the lingering opposition, Alfonso's will prevailed. In the winter of 1906, he traveled to Biarritz on the French coast, where Ina and her mother were staying at the Villa Morisco. There, amidst the elegant seaside gardens, he formally proposed. The engagement of the King of Spain to the granddaughter of Queen Victoria was announced to the world. It was a sensation. Ina, the quiet princess from the periphery of the British court, was now destined for one of Europe's oldest and grandest thrones. Preparations began for a wedding of breathtaking splendor. Her trousseau, filled with magnificent gowns from the finest Parisian couturiers, was a subject of breathless newspaper reports. The Spanish people, their initial skepticism overcome by the romance of the story and the promise of a grand national celebration, prepared to welcome their new queen. In May 1906, Ina made her final journey as a British princess. She traveled to Spain, where she was met by Alfonso and a nation ready to celebrate. Madrid was a city transformed. Banners and flags adorned every building, and vast, excited crowds poured into the capital from all corners of the country, eager to glimpse the beautiful Reina Inglesa. For a few brief days, it seemed as if the fairy tale was real. The ceremony was to be held at the magnificent royal monastery of San Jerónimo el Real. Ina was a vision. She wore a gown of shimmering white satin, embroidered with silver and a cascade of orange blossoms. On her head, she wore a spectacular new diamond tiara, crafted by the jeweler Ansorina, featuring the fleur-de-lis, the symbol of the House of Bourbon. It was a gift from Alfonso, a piece of jewelry that would become an iconic symbol of the Spanish queens for generations to come. As she walked down the aisle, she looked every inch the queen she was about to become. The ancient church was filled with the royalty of Europe, the grandees of Spain, and the solemn, impressive ritual of a Spanish royal wedding mass. Alfonso, in his captain general's uniform, beamed with pride. They exchanged their vows, and Princess Victoria Eugenie of Battenberg became Her Majesty the Queen of Spain. After the ceremony, the newly married couple climbed into a magnificent horse-drawn state carriage for the procession back to the royal palace. The streets were a sea of humanity, a deafening roar of cheers and applause accompanying them along the route. It was the triumphant climax of the day, a moment of pure, unadulterated public joy. Ina, smiling and waving to the ecstatic crowds, must have felt a wave of relief. The obstacles had been overcome, the ceremony was perfect, and the people of her new country were welcoming her with open arms. The procession moved slowly through the packed streets. As their gilded carriage turned from the Calle Arenal into the broader Calle Mayor, approaching the palace, the roar of the crowd was suddenly pierced by a different sound. From a fourth-floor balcony of a guest house at number 88, a man named Mateu Moral, a Catalan anarchist, threw a bouquet of flowers down towards the royal couple. Hidden inside the beautiful blossoms was a deadly Orsini bomb. The device missed the carriage, hitting the tram lines in the street just in front of the lead horses. The explosion was catastrophic. A deafening blast ripped through the festive air, followed by a cloud of thick, acrid smoke and the sickening screams of the wounded and dying. The street, a moment before scene of jubilation, was transformed into a charnel house. The bomb killed over 24 people, guards from the royal escort, soldiers, and innocent men, women, and children who had come to celebrate. Over 100 more were grievously injured. The street ran with blood. Inside the carriage, the young couple was miraculously shielded from the main force of the blast. The windows shattered, and shrapnel tore into the ornate woodwork, but they were physically untouched. In that moment of supreme chaos, Alfonso's reaction was one of immediate, instinctive courage. He helped his new bride, who was in a state of profound shock, and quickly assured the public that they were unharmed. But the image that would be seared into the memory of all who saw it was that of Queen Ina, finally arriving at the safety of the royal palace. The blood on her wedding dress was a stain that could never truly be washed away. It was a symbol of the precariousness of her new position and the inherent danger of the crown she now wore. The fairy tale had lasted only a few hours. Her new life as Queen of Spain had not begun with champagne and celebration, but with a baptism of blood and terror. It was a horrifying welcome to her new kingdom, and a brutal, terrifying omen of the violence, political turmoil, and deep personal heartbreak that would come to define her reign. The crown had been placed upon her head, but she now knew with shocking certainty that it would be a heavy and perilous one to wear. The echo of the bomb on the Calle Mare did not fade with the smoke. It reverberated through the marble halls of the Royal Palace of Madrid, a constant low hum of anxiety that would underscore the entirety of Queen Victoria Eugenie's reign. The fairy tale had been violently torn apart, and in its place was a grim reality. For Ina, a 19-year-old girl in a foreign land, the experience was a profound psychological trauma. She had looked into the face of her new subjects and seen not just adoration, but the potential for terrifying, indiscriminate violence. The blood on her wedding dress was a stain that could never truly be washed away. It was a symbol of the precariousness of her new position and the inherent danger of the crown she now wore. In the immediate aftermath, King Alfonso XIII acted the part of the courageous monarch, reassuring his shaken people and projecting an image of strength. The trauma of the day may have even forged a temporary bond of shared survival between the newlyweds. But as the days turned into weeks, Ina began to discover that the Spanish court was a battlefield of a different kind, one of whispers, intricate protocols, and silent, unyielding judgment. The world she had entered could not have been more alien to the one she had left behind. The British court of her uncle, Edward VII, while formal, had a certain worldly pragmatism. It was modern, political, and connected to the pulse of a global empire. The Spanish court, by contrast, was an institution frozen in time. It was governed by a set of rituals and etiquette so ancient and rigid that they traced their origins back to the somber, grandiose court of Burgundy in the 15th century. Every action, from the way one ate to the manner in which one addressed a superior, was dictated by centuries of tradition. It was the most notoriously stiff and conservative court in all of Europe, a place where tradition was not just respected, but worshipped. For Ina, with her more relaxed English sensibilities and natural reserve, it was like learning to breathe underwater. Her every move was scrutinized. Her Spanish, which she had studied diligently, was still hesitant, and the lilt of her English accent was a constant reminder that she was an outsider, the inglesa. Her natural shyness, a product of her slightly insecure Battenberg upbringing, was almost universally misinterpreted. To the demonstrative, passionate Spanish grandees and their wives, her quiet demeanor did not read as modesty. It read as coldness, arrogance, and a disdain for her new country. She was fighting a battle on two fronts, trying to learn the labyrinthine rules of the court, while simultaneously battling the perception that she was an aloof and haughty foreigner. Her most formidable critic remained her mother-in-law, the Dowager Queen Maria Christina. The stern Habsburg matriarch had never truly wanted the match, and now she watched Ina's every faltering step with a critical eye, her own impeccable conduct as regent serving as a constant, unspoken rebuke. Ina was profoundly isolated, writing long, homesick letters back to her mother, Princess Beatrice, her only true confidant. She was surrounded by people, yet utterly alone. The one person who should have been her ally, her partner in this new life was her husband. But the initial infatuation that had driven Alfonso to defy his mother and his court began to cool with the daily realities of marriage. He was a man who craved excitement, adoration, and novelty. The quiet, reserved nature he had once found so enchanting in Ina now began to bore him. His restless energy and roving eye, which had been temporarily held in check by the courtship, soon reasserted themselves. The open secret of his infidelities became a source of deep humiliation for his new queen. She had given up her country, her faith, and her family for this man, only to find herself competing with a seemingly endless parade of mistresses, from aristocrats to actresses. The passionate love story that had been sold to the world was behind closed palace doors, rapidly decaying into a marriage of chilly formality and profound disillusionment. Amidst this growing personal unhappiness, Ina knew that her survival at court, her very purpose as queen, rested on one singular, all-important duty. She had to produce a healthy male heir. The stability of the Bourbon dynasty and her own precarious position within it depended entirely upon the cradle. The pressure was immense. Every month that passed without news of a pregnancy was a source of court gossip and national anxiety. Finally, to the immense relief of the monarchy and the nation, it was announced in late 1906 that the Queen was expecting. For 9 months, she was the center of the nation's hopes. This child would be the symbol of the dynasty's future, the living embodiment of the union between Britain and Spain. This baby, she must have prayed, would be the key to securing her place, and perhaps even to winning back her husband's affection. On May 10, 1907, just under a year after her blood-soaked wedding day, Queen Ina gave birth to a son. He was named Alfonso, after his father, and was immediately given the title Prince of Asturias, the designation for the heir to the Spanish throne. The birth was greeted with cannon salutes, cheering crowds, and jubilant celebrations across the country. A healthy son and heir had been born. Ina had fulfilled her sacred duty. It was a moment of absolute triumph, a vindication of the controversial marriage. The young prince appeared to be a beautiful, healthy baby, and for a few precious days, Ina must have felt a profound sense of peace and accomplishment. The joy was to be tragically short-lived. A few days after the birth, tradition dictated that the infant prince be circumcised. It was a routine procedure, but after the operation, the baby would not stop bleeding. The initial concern of the doctors quickly escalated into frantic, barely concealed panic. They tried every remedy they knew, but the bleeding, while slow, was persistent and uncontrollable. For hours, the life of the heir to the throne hung in the balance. As the doctors worked, a cold, sickening dread must have crept into Ina's heart. She knew this pattern. She had seen it before in her own brother Leopold. She knew what this uncontrollable bleeding meant. Finally, the grim diagnosis was confirmed. Alfonso, Prince of Asturias, heir to the Spanish throne, had inherited the royal disease. He was a hemophiliac. The genetic time bomb that Ina had carried unknowingly across the sea from England had just detonated in the heart of the Spanish monarchy. The curse of Queen Victoria had come to Spain. The fallout was immediate, catastrophic, and deeply personal. For Ina, the diagnosis was a blow from which she would never fully recover. It was the confirmation of a mother's worst nightmare, the beginning of a lifetime of fear for her son's well-being. But this was compounded by a crushing, overwhelming wave of guilt. In the eyes of the world, and more importantly, in the eyes of her husband, she was the sole cause of this dynastic disaster. She had tainted the proud bloodline of the Bourbons. King Alfonso's reaction sealed the fate of their marriage forever. This was not a shared tragedy to be endured together. In his view, it was a singular, unforgivable betrayal. His horror was not just that of a father for a sick child, but that of a king whose legacy was now threatened. He saw the diagnosis as a personal affront, a stain on his honor and his crown. According to many historical accounts, in the fraught, emotional moments following the confirmation of their son's illness, he confronted his wife. There was no sympathy, no comfort. Instead, there was a cold, brutal, and unforgiving accusation. He is reported to have said to her, simply and cruelly, "I will not forgive you for this." And he never did. From that day forward, the emotional and physical distance between them became an unbridgeable chasm. Any remaining affection he had for her seemingly vanished, replaced by a bitter resentment. He no longer made any serious attempt to hide his affairs. His philandering became flagrant, numerous, and public, a constant galling humiliation for his wife. He had sought a perfect queen to bear him perfect sons, and in his mind, she had failed catastrophically. The news was, of course, suppressed from the public, but within the claustrophobic confines of the court, the secret was known. For Ina's detractors, this was the ultimate "I told you so." It was the final damning proof that the marriage to the Protestant Inglesa had been a terrible mistake. Her isolation was now complete. She was a pariah in her own home. Trapped in a loveless marriage and burdened by guilt, Ina poured all of her thwarted affection and energy into her children. Her life became a cycle of anxiety and hope with each new pregnancy. Her second son, Jaime, born in 1908, was discovered to be deaf in early childhood. In 1910, she gave birth to a son, Fernando, who was stillborn. Her two daughters, Beatriz and Maria Cristina, were healthy. Then came her third son, Juan, born in 1913. He was, to everyone's immense relief, a healthy, robust boy, free from the family curse. He would become the quiet hope for the dynasty's future. But the ordeal was not over. Her final child, a son named Gonzalo, born in 1914, was also a hemophiliac. She was now the mother of two sons afflicted with a terrible disease. Her life as a mother was one of constant vigilance. She oversaw her sons' care personally, a hands-on approach that was unusual for a queen of that era. She lived in a state of perpetual fear, knowing that a simple fall, a childhood scrape, or a minor accident could trigger a life-threatening bleeding episode. But in the face of this profound personal agony and the cold rejection of her husband, Ina refused to crumble. If she could not be the beloved wife, she would be an exemplary queen. She carved out a public role for herself that was both meaningful and impactful, channeling her intelligence and compassion into social welfare. She threw herself into a mission to modernize healthcare in Spain, a country where nursing was still seen as a low-status occupation, often left to untrained nuns. Inspired by the work of Florence Nightingale in her home country, Ina became a passionate advocate for professionalizing the nursing corps. She sponsored schools, promoted new standards of hygiene, and used her royal patronage to give the profession a newfound respectability. She was a driving force behind the establishment of the Spanish Red Cross, serving as its president and guiding its development. She traveled the country, inspecting hospitals, founding clinics for the poor, and raising funds for tuberculosis sanatoriums. This was not merely the ceremonial charity work of a bored royal. It was a genuine, hands-on mission. It gave her a sense of purpose, a way to connect with the people of her adopted country, and a sphere of influence where she could affect real, tangible change, far from the suffocating judgment of the court. By the dawn of the 1920s, Queen Ina was a figure of immense public dignity. To the outside world, she was a dedicated, hard-working, and compassionate queen. But this public persona concealed a private life of quiet sorrow. She was a woman trapped in a gilded cage, estranged from her husband, alienated by the court, and haunted by the constant agonizing worry for the health of her sons. She had secured the succession with the birth of a healthy heir, but the damage to her marriage and her heart was irreparable. While she worked tirelessly to heal the sick of her nation, the political health of Spain itself was beginning to fail, mirroring the slow, painful decay of her own happiness. The foundations of the Spanish monarchy were cracking, both from within the palace walls and from the growing unrest in the streets beyond. We left Queen Ina as a figure of immense public dignity and profound private sorrow. She had navigated the treacherous waters of the Spanish court, survived a loveless marriage, and channeled her pain into a tireless mission of public service. She was a mother living in a state of constant gnawing fear for her two hemophiliac sons, her life a testament to quiet, steely resilience. As the world hurtled into the Roaring Twenties, an era of unprecedented social and cultural change, the Spanish royal family projected an image of glamour and modernity. Ina, with her impeccable taste, became a European fashion icon. Her patronage of the great jewelry houses like Cartier produced pieces of legendary beauty, and she and her elegant daughters, the Infantas Beatriz and Maria Cristina, were photographed at polo matches, car races, and seaside resorts, embodying a kind of royal chic. This glittering facade, however, concealed a reality that was rotting from within. The marriage between King Alfonso XIII and Queen Ina was now a hollow shell, an arrangement of cold public formality. They performed their duties together, standing side by side on balconies and at state functions, but behind the scenes, they led almost entirely separate lives within the vast emptiness of the royal palace. Alfonso's infidelities were no longer a matter of discreet rumor. They were a brazen and public humiliation for his wife. He had fathered several illegitimate children and carried on long-term affairs, making little effort to conceal them. The emotional and physical estrangement was absolute. Ina found her only solace in her children, her charitable work, and a small trusted circle of friends who understood the depth of her loneliness. Her primary focus, her all-consuming preoccupation, was the health of her sons. The Prince of Asturias, the heir to the throne, whom the family called Alfoncito, was growing into a young man. His life was an agonizing paradox. He was intelligent and sensitive, but his body was his prison. The constant threat of a fatal hemorrhage meant his life was a cocoon of restrictions. He was forbidden from playing sports, from riding horses, from any of the vigorous activities expected of a future king. This medical necessity chafed against his youthful desire for freedom and normality, creating a constant tension between the overprotective instincts of his terrified mother and his own desperate yearning to live. Each bruise, Each swollen joint was a fresh wave of terror for Ina, a reminder of the genetic curse she had passed on. Her younger son, Gonzalo, lived under the same dark cloud. Her second son, Jaime, who was deaf, faced his own challenges of isolation, struggling to communicate in a world that made few allowances for his disability. The one bright hope for the dynasty was her third son, Juan. Healthy, strong, and good-natured, he was the living proof that the curse had not claimed all of her boys. The weight of the family's future was placed squarely on his young shoulders, in a decision that reflected both a desire to prepare him for leadership and perhaps to remove him from the increasingly toxic atmosphere of his parents' court. Juan was sent to England to train as a naval officer at the prestigious Royal Naval College, Dartmouth. He was being forged in the British mold, groomed to one day save the Spanish monarchy that his father seemed to be steering towards the rocks. While Ina was fighting her private battles against illness and heartbreak, her husband was fighting a losing battle for his crown. The political situation in Spain was deteriorating rapidly. The country was plagued by industrial unrest, separatist movements in Catalonia and the Basque Country, and a disastrous colonial war in Morocco. The parliamentary government was weak and ineffective. In 1923, believing it was the only way to restore order, King Alfonso made a fateful decision. He supported a military coup led by General Miguel Primo de Rivera, effectively sanctioning the end of parliamentary democracy and the beginning of a dictatorship. Initially, the dictatorship brought a degree of stability. It cracked down on unrest and invested in public works. But by supporting the coup, Alfonso had tied the fate of the monarchy to the fate of the dictator. He had abandoned his role as a constitutional monarch and become an autocrat. This alienated vast swathes of Spanish society, the liberals, the intellectuals, the socialists, and the Republicans, who now saw the king not as a symbol of national unity, but as the primary obstacle to a modern democratic Spain. For 7 years, the country lived under authoritarian rule, but when the Great Depression hit in 1929, the regime's economic successes evaporated. Lacking popular support and abandoned by the military, Primo de Rivera was forced to resign in 1930. The dictatorship collapsed, and the full force of public anger now turned upon the one man who had enabled it, King Alfonso XIII. The final year of his reign was a slow-motion collapse. The political parties, from the center to the far left, began to unite in their opposition to the king. Republicanism, once a fringe movement, was now a powerful mainstream force. The atmosphere in the cities grew thick with tension, and calls for the king's abdication became louder and more insistent. For Ina, this national crisis was the terrifying public manifestation of the private decay she had endured for years. The institution to which she had sacrificed her entire life was crumbling around her, undermined by the very man who was supposed to be its ultimate protector. The breaking point came in April 1931. In an attempt to restore some semblance of constitutional order, the government called for municipal elections, the first free expression of the popular will in almost a decade. The vote, held on April 12th, was supposed to be about electing mayors and local councils. Instead, it became a national referendum on the future of Spain itself, monarchy or republic. The results were an unambiguous political earthquake. While monarchist candidates held their ground in the conservative rural areas, the Republican and Socialist parties won a landslide victory in almost every major city and provincial capital. In places like Madrid and Barcelona, the Republican victories were overwhelming. The message from the urban, modern heart of Spain was clear, decisive, and deafening. The people did not want the king. The 48 hours that followed were among the most tense in modern Spanish history. On April 13th, the streets of Madrid filled not with rioters, but with jubilant crowds celebrating the birth of a new era. They waved the red, gold, and purple flag of the new republic, singing and cheering. The atmosphere was festive, but it was also deeply menacing for the occupants of the royal palace. Inside, the king and his government were in a state of crisis. His ministers advised him that the army would not fight the people to keep him on the throne, and the civil guard could not guarantee his safety. He was faced with a stark and terrible choice: stay and fight, plunging Spain into a bloody civil war, or leave. To his lasting credit, Alfonso chose peace. He refused to be the cause of Spaniards killing Spaniards. The decision was made. The royal family would go into exile. The end came with a quiet, heartbreaking finality. The farewells were swift and emotional. On the evening of April 14th, King Alfonso XIII, the man who had been born a king, slipped out of the royal palace through a side door. He was driven through the night to the port of Cartagena, where he boarded a naval cruiser that would take him to France. He left alone, hoping that his solitary departure would appease the crowds and ensure the safe passage of his family. Ina remained behind for one more night, tasked with the agonizing duty of overseeing the family's departure from the home she had occupied for 25 years. It was a quarter century of her life, of births, deaths, joy, and immeasurable pain, all contained within those stone walls. Aided by a few loyal attendants, she moved through the now silent rooms, gathering what she could. Her primary concern was her famous collection of jewels. This was not an act of frivolous greed. In a world where their bank accounts could be frozen and their property seized, the jewels represented the family's only transportable and secure form of wealth. They were her insurance policy for a deeply uncertain future. She packed them herself, a queen reduced to the role of a refugee, securing the remnants of her shattered life. The next day, April 15th, 1931, Queen Ina and her 6 children made their own quiet, ignominious exit. There was no grand state departure, no tearful public farewell. They left by train from a private station, slipping out of the capital as Republican leaders were formally proclaiming the Second Spanish Republic from the balcony of a government building in the city center. As the train rattled northwards through the Spanish countryside, heading for the French border, Ina was leaving everything behind. She was leaving the country she had tried so hard to serve, the people she had worked to help, and the throne that had cost her so much. The crown she had received on that bright, terrible day in 1906, a crown that had so quickly become a crown of thorns, was now gone forever. Her reign was over. A new painful chapter of her life, that of an exiled queen and the matriarch of a deposed dynasty, was just beginning. The train that carried Queen Ina and her children across the Spanish border on April 15th, 1931, was not just a mode of transport. It was a time machine, hurtling them from a life of reigning monarchs into the bewildering and uncertain reality of political exile. Their arrival in Paris was a chaotic affair. They were met by King Alfonso, who had arrived the day before, and a frantic scrum of journalists and photographers, all eager to capture the image of a fallen dynasty. For the first time, they were no longer hosts in their own palaces, but guests in a foreign land, their lives a subject of public curiosity and pity. They were refugees, albeit royal ones. The family initially settled at the Hotel Meurice in Paris, before moving to the historic Château de Fontainebleau. Here, they attempted to reconstruct a semblance of a court without a kingdom. A stream of loyalist monarchies, hopeful politicians, and displaced aristocrats flowed through their doors, creating a microcosm of the Spain they had left behind, a world rife with political intrigue, competing factions, and desperate hopes for a swift restoration. But the unity that was so crucial for an exiled cause was fatally undermined by the final, irreparable collapse of the central relationship, the marriage of the king and queen. Exile did not heal the wounds between Alfonso and Ina. It ripped them open completely. Freed from the public obligations of the crown, Alfonso fully embraced the hedonistic lifestyle of a wealthy playboy. The pretense of a marriage was dropped. Within a year of leaving Spain, they officially separated. It was a quiet, civilized arrangement, but it was a final, definitive end. Alfonso, with his two healthy daughters, the Infantas Beatriz and Maria Cristina, eventually moved to Rome. Ina, with her sons, would lead a more nomadic existence before finally settling in Switzerland. She was now truly the matriarch of her own fractured branch of the family, alone and responsible for the sons whose fragile health was her constant torment. The long, agonizing chapter of her marriage was over. A new chapter, one that would be defined by a relentless cascade of personal tragedies, was about to begin. The 1930s would prove to be the most devastating decade of Ina's life, a period where fate seemed determined to test the very limits of her endurance. The political drama of the exiled throne continued to play out. In 1933, her eldest son, Alfonsito, the former Prince of Asturias, dealt the traditionalists a severe blow. After falling in love with a beautiful Cuban commoner, Edelmira San Pedro Ochejo, he chose love over his dynastic duty, formally renouncing his rights to the now defunct throne in order to marry her. A few weeks later, Ina's deaf son Jaime was pressured by his father, who argued that his disability made him unfit to rule, to renounce his rights as well. These events, while painful for the family's pride, officially cleared the path for Ina's one great hope, her healthy, capable third son, Juan, who now became the undisputed heir to his father's claims. But these dynastic maneuverings were soon to be overshadowed by a series of losses so profound they are difficult to comprehend. In the summer of 1934, Ina was holidaying with her youngest child, the 19-year-old Infante Gonzalo, in Austria. Gonzalo, a hemophiliac like his older brother, was driving a car with his sister Beatriz when he swerved to avoid a cyclist and hit a wall. The accident seemed minor. Both walked away seemingly unharmed. But Ina's life of constant vigilance had taught her to fear the invisible. Gonzalo had suffered internal abdominal bleeding. In a healthy young man, it would have been a painful but recoverable injury. For a hemophiliac, it was a death sentence. The doctors were helpless. For 2 days, Ina watched as her youngest son slowly and agonizingly bled to death. She had lost her baby, the first of her afflicted sons to be claimed by the family curse. The grief was still raw when, 4 years later, fate delivered a second, chillingly similar blow. In September 1938, her eldest son, Alfonsito, was living in Miami. His marriage to Edelmira had ended in divorce, and he had recently remarried. One night, he was a passenger in a car that swerved to avoid a truck and crashed into a telephone booth. Once again, the accident was minor. Alfonsito, who was known for his reckless driving, a tragic defiance of his condition, walked away with only minor cuts and bruises. But like his brother, he was bleeding internally. He was rushed to hospital, but his body, weakened by a lifetime of bleeds, could not withstand the trauma. A few hours later, at the age of just 31, he died. Ina, thousands of miles away in Europe, received the news by telegram. She had now lost both of her hemophiliac sons. Both had died in their youth far from home in minor car accidents that had been rendered fatal by the invisible affliction she had passed on to them. It was a double tragedy of almost Greek proportions, a burden of grief and guilt that would have shattered a lesser woman. While Ina was enduring this almost unbearable personal calvary, the country she had once ruled was descending into its own hell. The Spanish Civil War, which erupted in 1936, was a brutal 3-year conflict that tore the nation apart. From her home in Switzerland, Ina watched in horror. She was appalled by the ferocious anti-clerical violence of the Republican side, which saw priests and nuns murdered and churches burned. But she was deeply ambivalent about the nationalist faction, led by the calculating General Francisco Franco. While the nationalists claimed to be fighting for traditional Catholic Spain and included many monarchists in their ranks, it was clear that Franco was no selfless crusader for the Bourbon cause. He was a man driven by his own ambition. When Ina's son Juan, the heir, made a daring attempt to cross the border and fight for the nationalist cause, he was promptly arrested by Franco's forces and unceremoniously sent back to France. The general wanted a monarchist victory, but he would not tolerate a king who might challenge his own supreme authority. The war ended in 1939 with a nationalist victory. Franco was now the undisputed dictator of Spain. A few months later, as Europe was plunged into World War II, a final chapter of Ina's old life came to a close. Her estranged husband, Alfonso, who had watched his country's destruction from Rome, died of heart disease in February 1941. Just before his death, he had formally abdicated his rights in favor of Juan, ensuring the legitimacy of the line of succession. For Ina, the death of the man she had once loved so passionately and who had caused her so much pain must have been a moment of complex, bittersweet closure. During the Second World War, Ina remained in Lausanne, in neutral Switzerland. Her life was one of quiet solitude, her family scattered across a continent at war. She waited, as the world waited, for the storms to pass. When peace finally came to Europe in 1945, her life's mission crystallized. All her hopes, all her energies were now focused on a single objective: the restoration of the Spanish monarchy in the person of her son, Juan, and, looking to the next generation, her grandson, a young boy named Juan Carlos. But the path back to Madrid was blocked by one man, General Franco. The dictator had declared Spain a monarchy in 1947, but in a bizarre political twist, he kept the throne vacant, naming himself regent for life. He held the promise of a restoration like a carrot on a stick, using it to ensure the loyalty of the monarchists while consolidating his own power. He entered into a long, tense negotiation with Juan, the heir in exile, whom he distrusted. The result was a painful, high-stakes gamble. In 1948, Franco agreed to oversee the education of the young prince, Juan Carlos, in Spain. For Ina and her son, this meant sending the 10-year-old boy, the future of their dynasty, to live in the country of a dictator, to be molded and educated under his watchful, controlling eye. It was a terrible risk, but it was the only path that might one day lead back to the throne. And so, as she entered old age, Queen Ina's life became a long, patient vigil. From her villa, Vieille Fontaine, in Lausanne, she watched from afar. She was the matriarch of a dynasty in waiting, the keeper of its traditions, and the living link to a past that was fading into memory. She had endured more tragedy than most people could imagine: a terrifying marriage, a genetic curse that had claimed 2 of her beloved sons, the loss of her crown, and decades of lonely exile. Now, her personal story was subsumed by the grand political waiting game being played out in Spain. Her life, which had begun in the heart of the British Empire, was now a quiet, prayerful vigil, focused on the future of a grandson who was being raised to reclaim the crown she had been forced to leave behind. We left Queen Ina in the twilight of her long and tumultuous life, an elderly matriarch living a quiet, secluded existence in Lausanne, Switzerland. She had survived everything: a traumatic introduction to her reign, the agonizing discovery of the genetic curse that claimed two of her sons, the slow, painful death of her marriage, the loss of her crown, a brutal civil war in her former kingdom, and 2 world wars. Her life had been a relentless series of losses, yet she endured, her focus narrowed to a single, burning purpose: the eventual restoration of the Spanish monarchy through the line she had secured. She was the keeper of the flame, a living testament to a past that was rapidly fading, her hopes pinned on a grandson who was navigating the treacherous political landscape of Franco's Spain. Her home, the Villa Vieille-Fontaine, became a small, quiet island of Spanish royal tradition in the heart of Switzerland. Her days were ordered and routine, a life of correspondence, reading, and receiving visits from her children and grandchildren. The house was filled with ghosts and memories, photographs and mementos from her former life, a life of both splendor and sorrow. She remained the undisputed emotional anchor for her scattered family, a source of quiet strength and unwavering dignity. Her relationship with her grandson, Juan Carlos, was particularly vital. Through regular letters and occasional visits, she provided him with a crucial connection to his heritage, a living link to his great-grandmother, Queen Victoria, and the traditions of European royalty that were so different from the austere, militaristic world of Franco's Spain. She was his grandmother, offering affection and advice, but she was also his queen, reminding him of the weight of the destiny for which he was being prepared. In her care were the historic Spanish royal jewels, the magnificent collection known as the Joyas de Pasar. These were not her personal property, but treasures of the crown, meant to be passed from queen to queen. Guarding them was a sacred trust, a tangible expression of her undying belief that the dynasty would one day return. It was a symbol that, though she was a queen without a kingdom, she remained a custodian of its legitimacy, waiting for the day when she could pass them on to the next Queen of Spain. After 37 long years in exile, an extraordinary invitation arrived. In February 1968, Ina, now 80 years old and increasingly frail, was invited to return to Spain. The occasion was a moment of immense dynastic significance: the christening of her great-grandson, the infant son of Juan Carlos and his wife, Princess Sophia of Greece. The baby's name was Felipe, the future King Felipe VI. It was an invitation to come home, if only for a moment. The journey must have been a torrent of conflicting emotions. As her plane descended towards Madrid, she would have looked down upon a city that was almost unrecognizable, a modern metropolis that had risen from the one she had fled in 1931. It was a place that held the ghosts of her greatest joys and her deepest traumas. She was received not as a political refugee, but as a queen. The christening at the Zarzuela Palace was a profound moment of family reunion on Spanish soil. It was the first time 4 generations of the dynasty, Ina, her son Juan, her grandson Juan Carlos, and her infant great-grandson Felipe, had been gathered together in their homeland. The event was heavy with symbolism, a tacit acknowledgement from the Franco regime of the royal family's central place in the nation's future. During her brief visit, a famous anecdote reveals her unwavering dignity. General Franco, the dictator who had ruled Spain for 3 decades, requested a formal meeting. Ina politely but firmly declined, stating that she had come to Spain for a family celebration, not for a political engagement. After a lifetime of being a pawn in the games of powerful men, she would not, at the end of her life, be used as a political prop. It was a final quiet act of defiance and self-possession. Her return to Spain was a fleeting, bittersweet coda to her life. Shortly after, she went back to her quiet villa in Lausanne. Her long vigil was finally nearing its end. Her health, which had been remarkably robust despite her emotional trials, began to fail. On April 15, 1969, exactly 38 years to the day since she had departed into exile, Queen Victoria Eugenie died peacefully at the age of 81. Her death marked the passing of an era. She was the last surviving grandchild of Queen Victoria to have been born during the great monarch's reign. Her body was interred in a local cemetery in Lausanne, a Queen of Spain laid to rest in the soil of a foreign republic. The story of Queen Ina does not end with her death. It is in looking back that we can fully appreciate the complexities and controversies of her life. The central debate will forever be the tragedy of hemophilia. Was she simply a victim of the genetic lottery, an unwitting carrier in an age before genetic science was understood? Absolutely. But she also became a scapegoat. The brutal blame placed upon her by her husband and the Spanish court was a cruel manifestation of a misogynistic era that viewed women as vessels for dynastic purity, holding them solely responsible for any perceived taint in the bloodline. The immense psychological burden of this blame, coupled with a mother's grief, is almost impossible to fathom. Another point of historical debate is her character. She was often criticized during her reign as being a cold queen, aloof and unable to truly connect with the passionate Spanish people. But was this coldness, or was it a carefully constructed shield? Her reserved demeanor was a direct product of her formal Victorian upbringing. This was then compounded by the shock of the assassination attempt on her wedding day and the subsequent hostility of the court. Her famous reserve can be seen not as a failing, but as a necessary survival mechanism. And any accusation that she didn't care for Spain is utterly refuted by her life's work. The tireless, pioneering, and deeply compassionate effort she poured into revolutionizing the country's healthcare system. The true historical significance of Queen Ina's life became stunningly clear only after her death. Her long, patient vigil was ultimately vindicated. In November 1975, following the death of General Franco, her grandson, Juan Carlos, ascended to the throne. King Juan Carlos I did not continue the dictatorship, as Franco had hoped. Instead, he skillfully dismantled the authoritarian regime and guided Spain to become the vibrant, stable, and modern democracy it is today. The respected Spanish monarchy that exists today is the direct and undeniable legacy of the queen who spent half her life in exile, protecting the future of her line. And in a final poignant act of historical justice, her grandson brought her home. In 1985, at the command of King Juan Carlos I, Queen Ina's remains were exhumed from the cemetery in Lausanne. She was flown back to Spain with full military honors. She was finally laid to rest where she had always belonged, in the royal crypt of the monastery of El Escorial, the hallowed burial place of Spanish monarchs for 5 centuries. There she rests for eternity, alongside her estranged husband Alfonso, and, finally reunited in death, her 2 tragic sons, Alfonsito and Gonzalo. After a lifetime of displacement, the Inglesa was home. Princess Victoria Eugenie of Battenberg lived a life of staggering contradiction. She was the British princess who became the quintessential Spanish queen. She was the center of a glamorous modern court, yet lived a private life of medieval sorrow. Her marriage was a fairy tale that became a cautionary tale. She was born into the heart of global power, yet spent nearly half her life as a powerless exile.